Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Patterson. I hope you're all doing well. We've had a number of author interviews lately, but today I'm going to give you a brief overview of something we hear about all the time, but some of you might not know exactly what it is or what its effects are. I'm going to explore cortisol. Now, if you've been scrolling through your social media lately, it's probably come across your feeds or your For You pages. I want to be clear, this is a very in-depth topic and I can't guarantee that I'll be able to cover everything about cortisol. That would be nearly impossible in this format, but what I will do is explain what it is and some of the impacts that it has on your body. Now, first we have to start by defining cortisol. Now, what is cortisol? Cortisol is a steroid hormone. The first thing that might come to mind when some people hear me say steroid is an anabolic steroid. You might think of bodybuilders or maybe athletes who are illegally taking steroids to try to get some sort of competitive advantage on their opponents. This one is different. Rather than being an anabolic steroid, cortisol is actually a catabolic steroid. It's also known as the stress hormone because it helps manage stress. That's something that you'll hear quite a bit about today. Now, I think if most people were told that they could take a supplement or, take something that was going to help them manage stress, they would ask how much and where can I get it? The good news is you already have it. Whenever your body is stressed or physically or mentally, cortisol is released from the adrenal cortex to help manage your stress levels. Now, what that also means is when you work out, your cortisol levels are going to naturally increase. That is part of the physical stress I just mentioned. Now, when you exercise or do some sort of physical activity, your body is stressed. When your body is stressed, cortisol helps protect the body through its role in enhancing vascular activity, inhibiting inflammatory process, and increasing energy availability. Those are some of the functions, like I said at the top. There are other things that it actually does, but these are some of the most common that I'm going to talk about today. When cortisol is increased from physical stress, like in a workout, this is an acute increase. In other words, ideally, this will be a temporary increase to help your body deal with the stress it experiences during your physical activity. Remember, I said that cortisol is a steroid hormone, but it is not an anabolic steroid. Instead, it's considered to be catabolic. So cortisol stimulates the conversion of amino acids that break down proteins, inhibiting protein synthesis. It is said that cortisol has a greater catabolic effect on type 2 muscle fibers, possibly because they have more protein than type 1 fibers. Now remember, this is a temporary increase, and as the body recovers, levels will start to go down. Now, there are cases though where cortisol levels remain high, and when that happens, there is at least potential for adverse effects, and that's what we really have to watch out for. If cortisol is chronically high, that could be because of injury or constant stress on the body, maybe overtraining, some type of inflammation in the body. Now, the big question that comes up quite a bit, and you might have seen this lately, is does cortisol make you fat? Does it make you gain weight? I personally have seen misinformation and misleading information about cortisol, and I get a lot of questions from a lot of my clients that are concerned about it. The direct answer would be no, that cortisol, the release of cortisol, I should say, doesn't directly make you gain weight. There is a factor, though, that should be considered, and maybe where this whole topic can kind of be misleading. Now, cortisol can increase appetite, which can lead to weight gain. Now, I want to clarify that I'm not a registered dietitian, and if you have any additional questions and want to go deeper into the conversation, please find one in your area and make sure to look for that RD distinction. I just want to be transparent about that. I can, however, say that this information is backed by research. For example, a literature review published in 2023 in the Journal of Food and Dietetics Research explained that chronically high cortisol levels can increase the appetite for highly palatable and high-calorie foods. A study published in the Nutritional Neuroscience in 2020 explained that cortisol may increase ghrelin plasma levels, which increase overall effects of ghrelin, like raising caloric intake. Now, some of you might be saying, what is ghrelin? Again, there are a number of things that ghrelin does, but it has been called the hunger hormone. It's much more nuanced than this, I realize this, but a short explanation is that it regulates glucose, stimulates appetite, energy homeostasis, and carbohydrate metabolism. So you can see how the cascade of events might contribute to weight gain. It isn't the cortisol itself solely responsible for weight gain, but when individuals are stressed, we know that with that comes emotional eating. When someone is stressed physically or mentally, we know that cortisol is released, and based on research, we know that cortisol may increase the overall effects of ghrelin, which in turn encourages increased appetite and caloric intake. Now, studies have suggested that cortisol influences where the body stores fat. It tends to promote fat storage in the abdominal area, which we know is associated with an increase in health problems. So, if we know all of this, it makes sense that managing stress could help keep chronic cortisol levels down. In effect, managing appetite or emotional eating and keeping body weight and body fat at healthy and manageable levels. One way to do that, we know, is by exercising regularly. If you refer to some of my other episodes, we know that exercise is not only important for maintaining healthy body composition, but also managing stress levels. Again, exercise is going to increase acute cortisol levels, but is the chronic level that we want to watch out for. I do have to say that in a 2015 study that I read in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, which was performed by researchers from the Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, cortisol measures demonstrated a U-shaped relationship with BMI. Now, BMI can also be a controversial topic, I understand that, but in this study, it was used as a baseline. So, mean cortisol levels in this study were higher in those with anorexia nervosa than overweight individuals, but were again higher among obese participants. In other words, it was higher in extreme underweight and extreme overweight or obese people. So while the perception might be the negative effects of cortisol and ghrelin are apparent only in people who are obese, cortisol has measured high in severely underweight people too. Another interesting conversation surrounding cortisol gets back to the topic of exercise and the more familiar hormone of testosterone. How does cortisol affect testosterone, or maybe how does testosterone affect cortisol? These two hormones play a role in keeping the body balanced. So as we know, testosterone is anabolic by nature and cortisol is catabolic. Testosterone is important in building muscle, as we know, and maintaining lean mass, while chronic cortisol can lead to muscle breakdown. Remember cortisol's catabolic effects. This might sound confusing to some of you, and I'm going to throw in another wrinkle that might make it sound even more confusing. Cortisol has actually been associated with muscle gain. Hear me out here. When we train, and that training is intense, our body is stressed. Based on this whole conversation, we know that when the body is stressed, cortisol is going to increase. But what happens as a result of our intense exercise, during the muscle repair process, we are building muscle. So while correlation is not causation, an argument could be made that cortisol is associated with muscle gain despite its catabolic nature. One other topic that typically enters the conversation when discussing cortisol is caffeine and caffeine intake. Now, this is relevant because caffeine has been associated with increased cortisol. A very recent study published this year in 2024 used 120 university-level athletes in Pakistan. These were football players, or if you're in the United States, soccer players. The athletes were given caffeine in doses of either 3 milligrams, 6 milligrams, or 9 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. The researchers were testing the impact of caffeine on both testosterone and cortisol levels. Now, what they found was that caffeine at a dose of 3 milligrams did not significantly impact either testosterone or cortisol, and it was actually the 6 milligram dose that saw marked elevation in both testosterone and cortisol. For testosterone, there was a 103% elevation with the 6 milligram per kilogram dose, and a 56% increase in cortisol after taking the same 6 milligram dose. Now, if you're doing the math, that is much more caffeine than some people might ever dream of taking in a day. For example, if an athlete is 200 pounds at 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, that's about 540 milligrams of caffeine. Now, keep in mind, for healthy adults, the top range of caffeine intake per day is around 400 milligrams, and that might even seem high for some people. But these were the findings in this study. The findings are relevant with regard to athletes because caffeine can be a performance enhancer in not only raising the amount of circulating epinephrine, or more commonly you might know that as adrenaline, but also increasing testosterone. This might bring on additional conversations and debates. Assuming this study was in fact accurate, again, this was published this year, could an athlete who tests for elevated testosterone actually blame caffeine and their caffeine intake? I don't know. It's definitely an interesting conversation on its surface, at least. As for caffeine's effect on cortisol, we can use this information even for non-athletes. Cortisol levels are naturally high in the morning and decline throughout the day. What is the first thing most people do when they get up in the morning? They reach for caffeine, coffee or some other type of caffeine. Now, we can have a completely different discussion on why we feel like we need a dose of caffeine so early, but the fact is that 90% of adults globally use caffeine every day. In this sense, for better or for worse, we are increasing our already high cortisol by consuming caffeine in the morning. An argument could be made, though, that it's better to do that in the morning before cortisol begins to decline during the day. I remember this is simply one study. Others have suggested that caffeine intake in relation to cortisol is only an issue if your intake is chronically high, leading to chronically high levels of cortisol. Again, cortisol isn't bad. I think it's got a bad reputation for being something that we absolutely want to stay away from. That's not the case. We do want to avoid chronically high or chronically elevated cortisol. That is where health issues can begin to arise, but as we've learned, we need cortisol to help our bodies and minds deal with stress, and in some cases to help regulate glucose. But as one of my friends who is actually a scientist and professor once said, if we don't have cortisol, we would die. I think he was trying to be funny, but in many respects, he was also making a point of how important cortisol is for our body and the misinformation and misleading information that can offer a negative perception. Again, don't believe the misinformation. If you have more questions, please send them our way, or even better, find an expert in your area that can help you distinguish fiction from fact. Again, look for I would say for much of this conversation, maybe a registered dietitian would be able to answer some of those questions, or a doctor. The NSCA also has some great information on cortisol, and if you're interested, take a deep dive into the resources yourself by reading up on the research. You can find a number of great articles and reviews in our Human Kinetics journals. So thanks again for listening. I hope you were at least able to take some bits of information away from this that'll help you out. Take advantage of cortisol to help you deal with the stress in your life, but use the tips and information to help manage the stress and avoid chronic situations. Keep your stress and your cortisol low, and like our new favorite Olympic mascot once said, Chill to the next episode.